This is the Pretty Deadly Self-Defense Podcast. I'm Susie Collick, the founder of Pretty Deadly Self-Defense.
And I'm Kate Lismer, a writer, traveler, mother, and expat. As a woman who lives in a big city and likes to travel, I'm very curious about self-defense. I've never had any training, so I have a lot of questions.
And I have a lot of answers.
We figured you probably have similar questions too, and so we thought it'd be a great idea to share this conversation and put it in a podcast.
So welcome to the Pretty Deadly Self-Defense Podcast.
So I know that you've done a lot of work with refugees in Germany, and I wanted to hear you talk a little bit about your experience with the refugee women here, why you do it, what sort of needs they have in this community.
Mm-hmm. I just want to clarify that I've only done some work. It hasn't been easy to reach out to those communities, and when the refugee populations that came to Germany from Syria, Afghanistan, Eritrea, etc., were first in the temporary housing in the old airport in Tempelhof and in other places around Berlin, it was very difficult to access. So for me, for what I was doing. So I haven't been as prolific in this field as much as I would like to. The reason that I wanted to do it, and it's one of the reasons that I moved to Berlin, is because I had read about a guy who was living in the center in Tempelhof. And, you know, in these centers, for people who don't know, families, individuals had like some beds, and then they were surrounded by walls that were sort of like those hospital walls, you know, where it's like a sheet basically hanging on a metal frame. So there was no real privacy, no real private spaces. Anyway, this man, I read about it in the paper, this man had stabbed another man because the other man had molested his 6-year-old daughter. And this was, of course, horrifying news. But what it made me think about was Katrina in the United States, and how so many people who were displaced during Katrina were then housed in the football stadium. And it came out afterwards, but it was stories that were a bit buried in the news, as these often are, of a lot of sexual violence and aggression, and people like demanding sexual favors for protection and or in exchange for supplies. Just kind of a little bit of apocalyptic chaos at night when the guards would turn a blind eye, kind of stuff. And I thought, you know, this is humanity. This is the ugly side of humanity, but this is some of the things that happen when you throw a bunch of humans together. And surely it's happening in the centers here as well. But what's different is that these aren't Americans. A lot of these people are coming from Muslim countries, where women and the place of women in society is a little more restricted. So women don't feel as empowered necessarily to defend themselves. And sometimes if they do, they'll receive punishment either from the man and their family or from their community in general. So I wanted to work with some of these women to teach them some self-defense moves that could easily be covered as everyday moves, so that to reduce the risk of punishment and retaliation, but also to give them a little bit more empowerment and freedom of movement. And also, I was hoping to communicate the idea that they were already doing a great job of self-defense by getting their families out of war zones. Because I had, speaking with a few volunteers, quite a few women felt that they failed their families and that they were failures as mothers because they took their families out of their homeland to keep them alive from Assad. But, you know, these things are complicated. They're not black and white. So I was hoping to reach out to them and work with them a little bit, which I succeeded a little bit, not as much as I would have liked. And of course, these communities are still here, so there's still an outreach program happening, but it's slow. Yeah, and there's a lot of denial that this happens at all. So that was my obstacle in reaching these communities in the centers when people were still living in the centers, is a lot of the guardians of those communities. Remember, the German government kind of supplied the space for people to be temporarily housed in, and then we're like, okay, and everybody else figure it out. They didn't really supply any kind of structure or much of anything, really.
Last time I was down there was all these housing structures.
Yeah, now there's the container housing, which is a whole nother convert. Don't even get me started on that.
It's not working.
I don't know if it's working or not, but I happened to, just as an aside, really randomly at a brunch, I happened to meet one of the lead architects for that housing. And he told me that they were creating container housing, which is a big thing in Berlin in general. They're really expensive. They're like 15,000 per container or something like that. And again, that's temporary housing to move people out of the center, but still keep them in Tempelhofer Feld, but now in container housing, so they have more private spaces to live. And I said, well, how are you going to get them out of that? And he said, what do you mean? They can only be there for a maximum of 3 or 4 years, whatever it is. And then they have to go to other housing. And I said, well, good luck, because these people have been living with no private space between 2 and 5 years. And now you move them into a temporary private space, and then you're going to move them again. I mean, possession is 9/10 of the law, says every human spirit. So right. Good luck. Anyway, that wasn't the most pleasant of brunches.
Well, maybe like just from a purely self-defense approach, like what now, because we talked about this once before about using sort of natural movements that these women already have. Like, what were some of the things that you were able to kind of use as examples in their daily life?
One of them was, the one that springs to mind first, is actually just sort of an arm swing, and which is hard for me to describe. So it's kind of, let's use our right arm as an example, kind of raising your right arm up so that your hand is about the height of your head, and then just letting it drop with gravity and swinging it back, turning a little bit as you do that. And we worked on that move specifically for women basically whose asses were being grabbed in food lines, which was a big complaint. And they couldn't really do anything about it. So we worked on this sort of, arm drop and swing to get, the perpetrator's hand off of their bodies, but in a way that looked natural, that would look like, oh, I was just turning around and I accidentally bumped you out of the way. So they were really happy with that one, actually. We worked with people who may grab, so women coming from various, along the spectrum of orthodoxy in Islam. It depends, your clothes change a little bit, but generally all the women that I worked with were wearing fairly billowy pants or dresses or coats even. So if they were grabbed, oftentimes they may be grabbed by a piece of clothing rather than your arm or your leg. And learning how to turn with that and let another part of your body swing to strike someone away. So again, was pretty satisfying. Satisfying for them as well. I mean, they really enjoyed it. They were really suspicious in the beginning because we started with exercises that didn't look like any kind of self-defense. They looked like goofy warm-up exercises. And then we put them all together and showed how they could be applied. Mm-hmm. And then they really, really enjoyed that empowerment, that, oh, right. Now I see where I can apply this, and I see where I can cover up the move, and where this is useful. And usually a few of them would start like rolling off incidents, this time and this time and that time and that time. But actually with an air of excitement, they were really excited to like apply what they had learned.
That's great. And I wonder, now, were most of the moves that you taught the refugee women these sort of subtle, kind of discreet moves, or did
Yeah.
you also go into more combative
No,
self-defense?
they were all very subtle and discreet
Okay.
moves. Just because at that time, especially when I first got here 3 years ago and people were still living in the centers, they're still living in the centers. So if you retaliate with a more combative move, you've still got to survive in that center.
Right.
So you don't want to encourage punishment or invite or incite punishment. You don't want to turn an entire community against you, which can also happen. So these are survival techniques to get through where you are in that moment. It's I don't like, being a martial artist, and somebody who likes action movies. It would be great to teach people and work with people in, kind of movie-like ways with these big, extravagant movements, and it's very empowering, and it would be really cool. And I really enjoy watching movies like that. But I'm very concerned when I'm teaching self-defense, whether to refugees or non-refugees, with dealing with the reality that you are living right now. Not only the reality that you're living in right now to disrupt what may be happening that's hurting you, but also so that you can continue on whatever path that you're on. Because like the refugee women, not everybody has the option to suddenly shift. It's not like those women at that time could defend themselves and be like, well, I'm leaving the center.
Exactly.
I mean,
they're at the center.
They're stuck.
Yeah.
So it's taking the situation as it is and creating as much protection as possible, and empowerment as possible within those confines.
I think that's interesting. And I think that applies to a lot of women too, where whether you're in a domestic violence situation or maybe you're in a harassment situation at work,
Right.
like these are terminal, sort of ongoing, like persistent circumstances for people. And you can also learn ways of coping and defending yourself within that, without having to go Kill Bill style, but there's ways of protecting yourself and having some awareness. And also this seems like a way of not making yourself vulnerable. Like maybe for these girls, like if some perpetrator realizes like, oh, last time that was a bit of a scene, or last time she moved this way, maybe she won't be a target next time.
Right. So it's being a little more sneaky. So it's like, in ninjutsu, the most powerful ninja are the kunoichi, the female ninja. And it's sort of using these ideas, the ideas of the kunoichi, working with women, both in refugee situations and in life in general, because we can't always walk away from a situation. If you're a single mom with 3 kids and you're barely making the mortgage and you've finally got a job, and you're making just enough to so that you're not on welfare and you're not getting the benefits of welfare daycare, for example, and you're making just enough to maybe improve your life a little bit, but you have to put up with the sexual harassment at work. That's a rock and a hard place. So what can you do to get through that moment? However long that moment is, 3 months, 2 years, whatever it is. What can you do? What can you use now so that it doesn't grind you down?
In all the ways that we've talked about self-defense, it's important to remember that it's so much bigger than just these moves, right? That there's so many,
right.
It's a lot about self-discovery and self-awareness and
self-trust,
right?
Self-confidence, self-care, self-love.
Pretty Deadly Self-Defense is a self-defense program created by a 20-year martial arts veteran and violent crime survivor, Susie Collin, based in Berlin, Germany. You can learn more about Susie and the Pretty Deadly Self-Defense program at prettydeadlyselfdefense.com.